I hate to interfere with our visiting time, but it is after 9 o'clock, and we need to start when we can. Everybody seems to enjoy this. It's a good time to get around and visit, and that's great. I'll try to give you a few minutes at the end to do that as well. Well, Jim told you last week that for this intervening period, between the time we've completed our work with the story and we begin a new quarterly week after next, that he and I were going to fill these 2 Sundays by just some lesson that we wanted to do. You know, occasionally churches will invite a group of particularly older preachers in a summer series and say to them, preach your favorite sermon. I've never been very good about picking my favorite sermon. It probably was whatever I preached the last time, because that's the one I best remember. I do remember a few years ago, one of the local congregations did what they called a Methuselah series. And they invited all older preachers to speak on their favorite subject. I remember Carol Ellis was on that list, and I thought that was a very appropriate way to at least honor and recognize people who had been preaching for a long, long time and give them an opportunity to do another class, but also to do it with something they were already familiar with. Well, with all that said, all I'm doing is, this is not a sermon, this is a class that I like to teach, and I'm going to repeat some material some of you heard before. But I kind of feel like Ira North, who said, if you've heard this before, don't stop me because I want to hear it again. And that's kind of the way I feel about this. One clarification for what Jim announced last week, we will begin 2 weeks from today a study of a new quarterly that focuses on a study of 1st and 2nd Timothy. And we will hand out those new quarterlies next week. And Jim, I just noticed we have some old quarterlies in the pulpit we need to clean out so we can put the spares there, because everybody knows that's where if they forget theirs, they can go borrow another. But at any rate, we look forward to that. A couple of the things I just wanted to mention in the beginning. I personally have really enjoyed our work with the story. I've tried to see 2 or 3 elders to commend them for choosing that method of study for us. I will admit that when we started, I was a little skeptical. I wasn't quite sure how this was going to work. But it's been a great experience for me and for Shirley, and I think for many of you. I've been grateful for the Sundays that I was teaching, that most of you seemed to be well aware of what we were talking about, and that meant you were preparing your lesson, and that's great. I think the fact that we were able to all do it together, I don't mean just us, but the whole congregation, was very meaningful. 4 or 5 weeks ago, just as an illustration, Mike Cochran came up to me right after the Bible study. We were standing here in the aisle, and he said, well, how'd your class go this morning? And I said, well, I didn't teach. This was Jim's day to teach. And he said, oh, I was just wondering how yours went. And I thought it was kind of interesting. Here are 2 teachers who could talk to each other about what we were doing in our separate classes, except I hadn't done it. Jim had done it that morning. But it was kind of nice to know that in the rest of the building, other people are covering much the same material. I think it's been a good study. I think it was a worthwhile study. I'm glad we did it, and it might be the sort of thing we could go back to at some future date. Well, those are all of my preliminaries I wanted to get out of the way, so let's begin with prayer. Father, for another Lord's Day, we're deeply grateful for the privileges that we enjoy on these days every week. Make a difference in our lives. We come to stand before your presence. We worship you. We honor you, we serve you, we try to obey your word, and you enrich our lives for all of that. We're grateful for this class and for the dedication to your word that it represents. And we pray as we focus on it for today and in the weeks to come, that you'll continue to bless our study. In Christ's name, amen. I have chosen for my topic today, 1 gospel, but 4 revelations. In that great list that Paul gives us in Ephesians 3 about all the ones, 1 Lord, 1 faith, 1 baptism, 1 God and Father of all, who's over all and in all and all that. He left a 1 out of there. He could have said 1 gospel, because there is 1 gospel. But interesting enough, the Bible has given us 4 accounts of that 1 gospel. Paul defines it in 1 Corinthians 15 when he says, I determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And he went on to explain that the gospel is really the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And again, interestingly enough, the Bible tells us all about those things, not once, not twice, but 4 times. And I know some people wonder, why do we need 4 accounts of the gospel? You'll remember that, at least in our Bibles, the title is given for each of those books, the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, the Gospel according to Luke, the Gospel according to John. What's all that about? It's simply affirming for us that each of those men, in his own way, was trying to tell us the gospel record as he knew it, as he understood it, and for those for whom he wrote. One of the distinctions about our 4 accounts of the gospel is that all 4 were written for individual audiences. And as we read each of those accounts, we discover, yeah, that's why he does this, and that's why this one does that, and why that one does something else. Because each one had a different group totally in mind as the appropriate recipients for their message. So I want us to look at the 4 revelations, the 4 accounts of the gospel that we have in the New Testament. They're not there to be duplicates. They're not there to be biographies. They're simply an account of the story as seen by one person. That takes nothing away from the concept of inspiration, because we recognize in reading any of the books of the Bible that the inspiration has allowed each writer to use his own personality. And we talk about vocabulary, and this writer prefers these sets of words, and this writer likes another set of words. And there is a personal nature, there is a personality behind each of those writings. So I want to take them individually. Matthew. Matthew does not come first because it was the first of the Gospels to be written. In fact, the order of the books in the Bible really has nothing to do with the order in which they were written. That's a fact that we discover later under different sets of circumstances. I do think it's appropriate that in compiling the New Testament, the books of the Gospel were put first. If I'm going to read the New Testament, I need to begin with the very heart of the New Testament, and that's the story of Jesus. That's why the book we've been studying is called The Story. Not to suggest this is fictional, this is made up, but this is a very basic set of principles and events that all lead to a common result. The gospel does that. And so the New Testament begins with those 4 books. And it happens to begin with Matthew. And it seems to me that Matthew is a very appropriate place to begin, because Matthew's book is written for Jews. It's Matthew who emphasizes over and over again in his account Jesus' Jewish connection. The genealogy that begins the book of Matthew is a genealogy that begins with Abraham, the father of the Jews, and comes up to Joseph, the father of Jesus. We follow that lineage all the way through. It takes us from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob to Judah, on up through David, on and on, until we come to the birth of Jesus. You may remember that in Matthew, you're going to find more references to prophetic messages than any of the other Gospels. It is Matthew who will repeatedly say, this was done that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet so-and-so, who said thus and so. Matthew does not want you to think he just suddenly pulled this out of the air. There was a reason for this. The prophets had said this would happen, this would be said, this would be done. This was the fulfillment of a prophet. And he knew that his Jewish audience knew the prophets, at least they were supposed to. It's interesting that when Paul appears before Agrippa later in the book of Acts, he says to Agrippa, I know that you know the prophets. That was a compliment to the man. Agrippa should have known the prophets. Well, any good Jew should have known the prophets. He should have been looking for the Messiah that the prophets had foretold for centuries. So Matthew is going to emphasize the Jewishness of the life of Jesus. He stresses Jewish events, Jewish feasts, Jewish gatherings, all of that. Interestingly enough, and this is kind of a quirk about Matthew, he's the only one of the four Gospels who even mentions the word church. He mentions it twice. He quotes Jesus as saying, "On this rock I will build my church." And then 2 chapters later, he talks about how to deal with difficulty within the church, and he says, if you can't work it out with a person, take it to the church. No other gospel writer ever uses the word church. Matthew uses it twice. Matthew becomes our major source of some terribly important events. Only Matthew records the fullness of the Sermon on the Mount. Luke will give us some sections of it, but it's Matthew who devotes 3 chapters to its entirety. And we just feel the very significance of that major portion early in Matthew of that very important sermon of Jesus. And interesting enough, it's in that sermon that Jesus connects himself with the law. You have heard that it was said by those of old, but I say to you, that contrast between what was said, what was expected, what was accepted, and what Jesus is now saying and what he expects of the people to follow him. Only Matthew makes that kind of distinction. So it's clear that Matthew is saying this is written for a Jewish audience. What he has to do, and the book of Acts is great at explaining how difficult this was, he's trying to undo the Jewish commitment to the old law to recognize that something new has come. It's kind of sad that for centuries the Jews have looked forward to the Messiah, but when he comes, they don't accept him. In fact, they do the very worst things. They kill him. And so it's Matthew who tries to say to that Jewish audience, those people he knew best, this is exactly what we were expecting, we were anticipating. Now, they didn't understand exactly how the Messiah was going to work, and that's evident in Matthew's account, that they really expected him to come and be a king, and first thing he was going to do was order all the Romans out of the land and reestablish order there, and everything's going to be fine. And that's not what Jesus did. So they had trouble with that. So there are those kind of interesting aspects to the work that Matthew does. Now, there is a paradox with Matthew, it seems to be, because when Jesus called him to be a disciple, he was a tax collector. A tax collector, one of the most despised men among the Jews. You couldn't trust tax collectors. Most of them were unscrupulous. The Roman government controlled those positions. Men could make an offer for it. They could offer so much money, if you would give me the job of the tax collector, and if he got the job, then he had to be sure he collected enough taxes to pay the Romans. But if he was a good businessman, he was going to charge extra taxes, so he made some money off it. So that's why the tax collectors were hated. They were looking for themselves. They satisfied the Romans, but they had to be satisfied too. And here is Matthew. Luke, for some reason, calls him Levi. But how could this man be accepted by the Jewish people enough to listen to him? He had a real handicap, I'm sure, though he doesn't acknowledge that in the writing. But he does tell us enough about how the people reacted generally to the tax collectors. He just had to know he was thinking about himself when he was writing that sort of thing. Matthew's book begins with some terribly important events. He gives us the coming of John the Baptist in great detail. Probably only Luke does more with John the Baptist than Matthew does. He tells us about Jesus coming to John to be baptized, and the little difficulty that was there about why should you be baptized? John recognized Jesus as being the Son of God. You don't need to be baptized. Jesus said, I have to fulfill all righteousness. This morning in our daily Bible reading, we're in Matthew right now, and we read this morning about the baptism of Jesus by John. It comes very early. And then it's followed up immediately by a chapter devoted to Jesus' temptations. It's as if Matthew wanted to get in the very beginning of his book the background of Jesus and his genealogy, the birth of Jesus, the coming of John the Baptist, the baptism, the temptations. There's no leisurely stroll into Matthew. You're hitting major event after a major event. Let's go back to the birth for a moment. I failed to mention that in Matthew is the only account of the birth of Jesus that focuses on Joseph and the wise men. Luke's going to focus on Mary and the shepherds. Each writer chose the thing that most appealed to him. But here's Matthew, who gets these major events in immediately and then turns from that to the Sermon on the Mount. So the first 8 chapters of Matthew are pretty focused. There's no sense of just kind of hither, thither, and yon. There's something very specific to cover. Matthew gives us one of the largest number of parables. Chapter 13, for example, in Matthew has 5 parables in it. He's going to cover a lot of parables, and he explains why the parables were being used. Matthew gives us a number of the miracles. He gives us a good coverage of Jesus. And if you read Matthew's account, you come away knowing a great deal about what he was doing and when he was doing it, and where he was, and who was associated with him, and then what happened. We get the promise of the church, Matthew 16. We get the arrest of Jesus, the trials, the mockery of trials, the crucifixion, the burial, the resurrection, and the giving of the Great Commission. In a sense, Matthew hits all the high spots in the life of Jesus. And again, that's so essential for that Jewish audience. If he can convince the Jews, this is the one Isaiah foretold, this is the one Jeremiah foretold, this is the one Elijah foretold, over and over again. So that's Matthew. What about Mark? First thing we notice about Mark is this is the shortest of the Gospels. Only 16 chapters, 28 in Matthew. Put them side by side, Mark's kind of skimpy. Mark's account was written primarily for those Romans who were living in the land. They weren't interested in prophecy. They didn't care whether this was the fulfillment of prophecy. They wanted facts, kind of like the old Dragnet show, we just want the facts, ma'am. That's what Mark does. He focuses on the facts. Doesn't do a lot of background. In fact, Mark's account begins with the beginning of Jesus' ministry. The first verse in Mark talks about the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. It's interesting, all these writers stress beginnings, but it's John that we think of most often. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Mark says, the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. He doesn't tell us anything about the birth of Jesus. Doesn't tell us anything about the birth of John. Mentions John coming and baptizing Jesus. It's just kind of like, let's get this thing moving. Let's get to the major point first. One early commentator on the book of Mark says, Mark gallops. There's no leisurely stroll through Mark. I learned when I was a high school freshman taking Bible under dear brother John L. Rainey, the key word in the book of Mark is straightway. It's repeated over and over again. It's Mark's way of saying, let's get on. And the next thing, and the next thing. The New King James has the words and then, over and over. It's almost like a child telling a story. This happened, and so-and-so happened, and so-and-so happened, and so-and-so happened. Mark's just going to gallop through it. Going to get to the end in a hurry. Mark does not give us many of those little vignettes that we kind of like to read in the Gospels of Jesus and another person and what motivated that meeting and what they talked about. And again, there's nothing leisurely about Mark. He's galloping through the story of Jesus. He's going to get the most in he possibly can. Tradition says, and we don't always pay a whole lot of attention to tradition, but it's possible. Tradition says that Mark got his account of Jesus from the Apostle Peter. And the only basis we have for making that statement is at the end of 1 Peter, Peter refers to my son Mark, indicating that Peter must have had a relationship with Mark somewhat similar to the relationship Paul had with Timothy, which meant he spent some time with him, he listened to him. Because of Mark's mother owning a house where the church met in Jerusalem, Mark likely had an opportunity to hear a number of people talk about Jesus, one of whom was Peter. When Peter was freed from prison, the first thing he knew was the church was going to be at Mary's house, so I'm going to go there. And he goes to Mary's house. Mark would have known Peter then, maybe later. Mark is one of those interesting characters who has a good side and a questionable side. And we spend our time trying to decide what we think about John Mark. Some folks think he's just kind of a typical teenager who couldn't decide where he was going. Well, we don't know he's a teen. But we do know that Paul was impressed enough with him to ask him to go on the first mission journey, and with him and Barnabas, because Barnabas is his uncle, and it's a great tie for them to be together. But then suddenly in Perga, Pamphylia, Mark went home. We don't know why. Whatever the reason was, it was serious enough that when Barnabas suggested that they do a second mission journey, and let's try Mark again, let's give him a chance to redeem himself, Paul said no, and was so insistent that we wound up with two mission teams, Paul and Silas, Barnabas and Mark. And it's interesting that the first place Barnabas goes with Mark, he goes to the island of Cyprus, which was where Barnabas and Mary were from. It's like he was going to take Mark back to the home territory. Let's go back to the old farm, the old place, old folks' home. And sort of begin there, see if we can rejuvenate some interest in him. We know later Mark restores himself in Paul's judgment, because Paul writes in 2 Timothy, bring Mark, he's useful to me for ministry. Somewhere between Acts 15 and 2 Timothy 4, Mark redeemed himself. Maybe somewhere in there he was writing the gospel of Jesus. Mark hits all of the basic points. There are a few miracles, a few parables, but again, I emphasize the fact that he just kind of deals with the things that are most essential. Anybody wants a quick read of the gospel, Mark is it. Get it pretty quickly. But in order to have only 16 chapters, something gets left out. And you don't know what's left out until you've read Matthew or Luke or John. But there's Mark. And then there's Luke. Luke is probably the most sophisticated, maybe the best educated of the four writers. He tells us in the beginning of his book that he has done careful research. He wants to present a well-ordered account of Jesus. He acknowledges that other people have obviously written down things, and he wants to be sure that his account is as thorough and as accurate as is humanly possible. Luke was a good researcher. Now, a couple of interesting facts about him. Number one, he's not Jewish. He's a Gentile. He's the only Gentile writer in the New Testament. And obviously his audience is the Gentiles. He's going to focus not on the Jews, Jesus coming to satisfy the prophets. He's going to focus on the Gentiles, the one to whom Jesus also brought good news. Even in that passage that Jesus read in Nazareth out of Isaiah, talks about being a light to the Gentiles. And then Jesus said, this scripture was fulfilled here with you. It was Luke's way of saying to the Gentile world, he's not just a Jew. He didn't come just to the Jews. He came to us too. Even Matthew hints at that in his account of the Great Commission when he has Jesus say, go teach all nations. Not just the Jewish world, all nations. So Luke focuses on that. The beginning of Luke is the most detailed of the four beginnings. Luke begins with the story of Elizabeth and Zacharias and the fact that they have no children. And then an angel appears to Zacharias and says, Elizabeth's going to have a child. And you read that account, and you have to go all the way back to Abraham and Sarah and think about an older couple who are well beyond childbearing years, and they're going to have a child. And this is no ordinary child. This is the forerunner of Jesus. So we have the story of the beginning of that whole possibility. We have the very fact that Zacharias questions this to the point that the angel strikes him mute. He will not be able to speak until after John is born. And then Luke tells us about the angel coming to Mary, telling her she's going to have a child. And there's a relationship somewhere there between Elizabeth and Mary finds out that Elizabeth is pregnant, so she goes to see her. And these two women get to share their stories of pregnancy, an old woman and a young woman. No other gospel writer tells us all of that. And then when Luke gives his account of the birth of Jesus in Luke 2, as I've already said, his focus is on Mary, giving us the background of how we got here, and on the shepherds. When we want to read the story of the birth of Jesus, we are most drawn to the book of Luke. There's just something about those words that just roll out in a magnificent form. There are a number of things that are unique about Luke. For example, Luke is the only one of the writers who tells us the parable of the Good Samaritan. And that's interesting particularly because Luke tends to focus on Samaritans. Where Jews don't have anything to do with Samaritans, Luke points out some Samaritans that deserve attention. The Good Samaritan. The 10 lepers who come to Jesus and only one turns back to thank him. He was a Samaritan. Luke deals with that kind of thing. Luke tells us the story of two of the 3 resurrections that Jesus did. He tells us about the daughter of Jairus and the son of the widow of Nain. Luke focuses on those children who are raised from the dead. Luke's parables are really significant. I've already mentioned the Good Samaritan. He's the only one who does some of those beautiful parables. The parable of Luke 15, those 3 parables about the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost boy. Only Luke tells us that. Luke goes into great detail to tell us about the crucifixion as well as the resurrection. Luke gives us in detail that story of the two people on the road to Emmaus talking with the resurrected Jesus. Mark mentions it in one verse. Luke details it. And Jesus spends time with that couple. And as he acts like he's going on, they say, no, you need to stop and eat with us. And I've already told you before, I'm convinced that that's a husband and wife. Only a wife would have word enough to say to Jesus, no, you need to eat something. Speaking of that, it's only Luke who tells us about Jesus having a meal with Mary and Martha. And we discover the difference in those sisters in terms of the things they're most interested in. But I'm going to run out of time, so let's move on to John. We typically say of Matthew and Mark and Luke that they are synoptic gospels. That means they essentially follow the same chronology. You don't get a distorted chronology with them at all. They just kind of hit most of the same things moving along. You can almost chart those 3 books. John's is the exception. John is what you call a sui generis, one of a kind. He's unique. No other book like John. John really begins at the beginning. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. John focuses on Jesus as the Word incarnate. The Word came to life. That's Jesus. He's not worried about prophecy, not worried about satisfying the invading Romans with local legends and local stories, not really concerned with what Luke is trying to do with the Gentile world. John's is likely the last of the four Gospels to be written, and it seems to me that it's directed at Christians. It's John's way of saying, this is our heritage. This is who we are. This is where we came from. This is what Jesus was doing for us. John's Gospel is unique in that it focuses on most of those long-range conversations. It's not just a casual encounter. It's somebody who comes to Jesus or Jesus goes to and engages in a long conversation. Chapter 2, we have the first miracle of Jesus at the marriage feast in Cana of Galilee. Though John does not call them miracles. For John, they are signs. Signs. It's not just doing something that's unusual, out of the ordinary. It is a sign of something. Jesus is signaling what else he can do. John chapter 3, we have Nicodemus coming to him by night and that lengthy conversation with him. Chapter 4, Jesus in the little town of Sychar and engages a Samaritan woman. Here again is a Samaritan. And it's only in John that we get the statement, the Jews have nothing to do with the Samaritans. But Jesus has a lot to do with that woman, teaching her. So we encounter those kinds of things in John. John's detailed encounters and the sermons of Jesus that he records are much lengthier than they are in any of the other Gospels. When Jesus begins talking about, I'm the vine and you're the branches, in John 15, pretty detailed. When John has to tell Peter, you're going to deny me, John chapter 13. Chapter 13 is such a great chapter. That's when Jesus is having the Last Supper with the apostles and he washes their feet and ends that chapter by saying to Peter, you're going to deny me. If we didn't have that chapter division that follows there, we would move immediately from chapter 13 to John 14, where Jesus begins by saying, but don't let your heart be troubled. He just said to Peter, you're going to deny me, but don't let your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it weren't so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go, and I'll come and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. I think it's a great transition to move from 13 to 14, from an indictment to an assurance. And we lose that with chapter divisions. We read 13 and we read 14, and we never think about how they fit together. But the great consolation of 14 is written against the backdrop of saying to Peter, you're going to deny me. He's already said to Judas, he's going to betray me. All the bad things that just come out, pouring out in chapter 13. 14, there's that great assurance. Where I am, there you may be also. John chapter 17 is the real Lord's Prayer. What Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount, he taught as a model prayer. If you're going to pray, here's the kind of form you use. But in chapter 17 of John, he pours out his heart to the Father, pleading first for his disciples, that they may be one as you and I are one, Father. Pleading for what's going to happen as he leaves. And then John's account of the crucifixion and the resurrection, again, are in great detail. Only John tells us about the resurrection of Lazarus from the dead, and that's a great story, John 11. In John 12, after Lazarus has been raised from the dead, somebody throws a great feast, invites Jesus to it. Jesus and Lazarus were the guests of honor. Everybody wanted to meet Lazarus. They wanted to see him. He's been raised from the dead? What was it like to be dead? And I've often said and thought more frequently, if there were a lecture circuit in those days, Lazarus would have made a lot of money going on the lecture circuit telling, what was it like to be dead? He had a story to tell. When people came to that dinner, they wanted to hear him, see him. Was he really dead? And again, we have Martha doing the serving and Mary doing the worshiping, just like we had in Luke 10 when they were at that house for a meal. John is the one who gives us the greatest emphasis on Mary Magdalene, and that's mostly at the resurrection of Jesus. So, one gospel, 4 revelations. John probably gives us the greatest summary of any of the other gospels. He concludes what we know as chapter 20 by saying, many other signs and wonders truly did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. Just as Luke acknowledges, I've been doing research to learn as much as I can, John says, I've tried to pull together as much as I can. Jesus did more than I can write in this book. He's going to acknowledge in chapter 21, if you could cut them all together, the world couldn't hold that book. But these are written. John said, the reason I've chosen these are written that you might have life in his name. That's why I say John has to have been written for Christians. It's to say to them, you have a reason to believe what you believe. You have reason for your faith, and you have reason for your faithfulness. The gospel, the death, the burial, the resurrection of Jesus. What a story. Thank you very much for being in our class.